Hello and welcome back to the Skype Sessions. This season we're going to be bringing in more guests onto these Skype Sessions, particularly to talk about things that are related to what we're reading about in Screwtape at the time. Now, in the last episode we were discussing the preface, and we told you a little bit about the different prefaces that are out there. The two main ones, one from the 40s and one from the 60s, but also the interesting factoid that the handwritten version from the 40s is a little bit different. And I knew that Brenton Dickieson had done a whole lot of work on Screwtape and on these prefaces, so I wanted to bring him onto a Skype session just to fill out the story and also go into a little bit more detail about what we learn from this handwritten version. So Brenton, welcome back to Pints with Jack. Last time it was a regular episode, now it's a Skype session. So yeah, you're practically an all-star at this point.
Oh, there we go. Great to be here. Thanks, David.
So would you mind just kicking things off for us? There's this preface that Lewis wrote in the 40s. There's a typewritten version, there's a handwritten version, and they are not the same. You wrote an article about this on A Pilgrim in Narnia. So can you tell us what happened and what's the difference?
Yeah, sure. I mean, it came out of kind of an accident. I was maybe you need to be in the right place to have the right accidents. But I had gone for the first time to the Marion E. Wade Center in Wheaton, in the Chicagoland, and was sitting there in kind of this Tolkien and Lewis archive with all this material around me. Had a project in front of me, and the project was failing kind of utterly. And it wasn't going well, which happens. If you go to archives, you should be patient. It takes a long time. And a day and a half in, so on the second day after lunch, I decided to kind of give myself a treat and just look at the Screwtape file. And I didn't really know what we had, except that I knew that the original handwritten manuscript of Screwtape Letters, the letters, was not there. But I knew there were other things there. And I was sitting there, and they handed me the file, and it was kind of fun. It's the first typescript. There are some handwritten letters and things in the file, and so then I kind of settled down to kind of lick my wounds over this failed project. And as I started reading, like, immediately things were different, right? So if you were to open up your Screwtape Letters, you'd probably see something. It says in the preface, "I have no intention of explaining how the correspondence, which I now offer to the public, fell into my hands." Right? And then there's this phrase, though, in the handwritten, "nothing will induce me." And immediately I was keyed off. This is different. Well, there's always little differences, but it continues in such a peculiar way that I had to check a number of times, including talking to a scholar next to me, Dr. Serena Higgins, to make sure that what I was seeing was real. And it said, "Nothing will induce me to reveal how my friend, Dr. Ransom, got hold of the script, which is translated in the following pages." And then all of a sudden, kind of like my mind just opened up to the possibilities. So I read and reread that before I even read the rest a whole bunch of times. And what I realized we had here was a manuscript, a handwritten document written in July. So, 6 or 7 weeks or so into the Screwtape series, that as it was being released weekly in a magazine, that is a kind of a literary playfulness that we don't always see in Lewis because we don't have many of his manuscripts, and so then I had to read more. So that was what kind of brought me in, and really what it asked the question was like, well, you have to ask the question, what's Dr. Ransom doing there, and who is he?
We haven't gone through the Ransom trilogy, so for those who are new to all of this, you might maybe sketch the outline of what that story is about.
Sure, yeah, just super basic. Sci-fi, kind of golden age sci-fi readers will know that C.S. Lewis, before Narnia, before even he became famous on BBC Radio and Mere Christianity, he did some kind of inventive sci-fi work. He sent Dr. Ransom was kidnapped, taken to Mars in a book called Out of the Silent Planet. when he was there, he discovered everything was kind of upside down from his expectations. Instead of, the Martians there looked like kind of, what they would have called, backward indigenous peoples, native peoples, with very low technology. But it turns out they actually had exceptional technology. They just chose to invest instead in art, literature, community, connection, and spirituality, and so everything kind of turns upside down for Ransom. He has this kind of transformation of experience, and then the series continues over the next couple of books. He has to go and do like an adventure to Venus, Perelandra, which is like an intervention, and then there's, in the last book, that Hideous Strength, written just near the end of the war, World War II. It's a dystopia, and there's this kind of battle takes place on Earth. So we have a Mars book, a Venus book, and an Earth book. And so, and Dr. Ransom ends up going from kind of this hapless, bumbling, self-conscious, scholar, with a bit of a wound from the previous war, to a kind of Arthurian superhero in the last book. And so those of us who like C.S. Lewis, those who read that Golden Age sci-fi, they know Dr. Ransom. And so it's just kind of funny, like, because if you've read the Screwtape Letters, there's nobody else mentioned. There's not even any real people specifically mentioned in the book. So like no prime ministers or, particular names on a street or anything. The only one thing was, I think the number 73 bus or something that Lewis got himself into trouble with. And so like,
yeah,
that's right.
Only pedants are going to complain. The 73 bus is nowhere near the British Museum.
That's right. So, like, Lewis made the mistake early about introducing kind of some of the real world elements at that time, and so he just didn't. The letters just have very little of that. Although but probably the war, World War II, haunts in the background. And so all of a sudden to have this very specific reference made me kind of want to say, what's up? What's the story? And as it goes on, it turns out there's that little phrase, but then there's an entire paragraph added that sucks the Screwtape Letters up into the fictional universe of the Ransom cycle, the Ransom Trilogy, which I call the Ransom cycle now. And so I don't. How much do we want to reveal, and how much do we want to kind of have people hunt it down?
Let's do all of it.
Okay, yeah. So that's right. So you have to ask, you have to kind of back up and say, well, what would a preface do? And the letters just appeared in a newspaper, a journal, Anglican journal, weekly, with not really any preparation, and some of the readers were sort of taken off guard. One person wrote canceling his subscription, saying that these letters were positively diabolical, right? And I've gone to look, and I can't find that letter, so I don't know if that was just sent to the editor and he didn't print it, but I can't find where that letter is. But that's kind of one of the things. And so Lewis, almost immediately, they were super popular. They were bought out. It was the war, so there was only a few printed. There's only a handful that exist in the world today of these full runs of the letters. One's actually in New York City. And so immediately a publisher approached Lewis and said, let's get these into print. Let's pull this into a book. And Lewis said, yeah, that would work, but we need a preface, obviously. And so Lewis writes this preface, and then it's the war, and so we have the prefaces, the typescript preface, the handwritten preface, and the manuscripts. We have those because Lewis didn't want to repeat any work. He was worried about getting bombed. And so he sent it off to a couple of, one a person he was kind of evangelizing to, and one a person that was sort of a literary mentor, Sister Penelope. He sent them each a version for different reasons. The one that went to Sister Penelope lands in the Berg collection in New York City, which is, the Ghostbusters library scene. Right. So that right
I visited New York. I went to the Empire State Building and the New York Public Library. And I went to the New York Public Library only so I could go out to the front where Ghostbusters was filmed.
That's right. And they have the big lions right out in front. So it's a good fit. But it's kind of an odd, like sitting at Charles Dickens' desk reading the Screwtape Letters was kind of a fun experience for me at one point. You have to have white gloves and fight your way in, but it's like just like in Ghostbusters. But and then the other one eventually went to Wheaton through I think Warren Lewis actually ended up getting it there. So And so yeah, you have that. We have these things because of the odd situation of the war. The letters sit behind the odd situation of the war. What's the connection with Dr. Ransom? And it's actually kind of cool. What you have is the question, well, like, what language would demons speak, right? And I presume,
if movies are anything to go by, it's always Latin for some reason.
yeah, that's right. Yeah, that's right. Latin. What was it in John Connolly's "The Gates of Hell Are Open"? Do you want to peek? I think it's Aramaic, right? And there's actually in Perelandra, there's a moment where one of the demonic figures actually speaks a little Aramaic, right? The original actually has a kind of a local accent, so that could be it. But what Lewis proposes is there's a kind of a universal language that existed at some point in the past, which figures, angelic and demonic figures, spoke, and planetary presences spoke. And then there was a large cosmic war, kind of sitting behind the story of Genesis 3 or John Milton's Paradise Lost. There's a large cosmic war, and Earth ends up being kind of sanctioned off because there's a fall here. There's a moving over to the fallen angel side. And so we become the silent planet. There's all kinds of life going out in the universe all around, but we're sanctioned off from that. We're quartered off, kind of a balkanization of our reality.
We're in quarantine.
In quarantine. It's kind of, yeah, that's a little too prevalent, I think, right now. But, but it's kind of it's probably even that mythic idea in Lewis is even richer than the literature itself in some ways. It's just such a huge and great way of translating these ideas. Well, in Out of the Silent Planet, because Dr. Ransom's kidnapped and burst out of Earth and taken to Malacandra, that quarantine begins to lift, that the ethereal worlds, the supernatural worlds all begin to mix. And what happens is that original language has been kept by the more angelic figures or planetary figures, as well as the demonic figures. And that language is what the locals speak on Mars and Venus. The local inhabitants speak this, Old Solar. Ransom calls it in the books. And so Ransom knows it. He was kidnapped and taken and learned the local language.
Which was very fortunate because he was a philologist.
He was a philologist. It's kind of one of the funny parts of the book. Like, if I showed up and I saw the alien, I guess I probably wouldn't be thinking what he was thinking. He was thinking, oh my goodness, there's a language pattern here. I could learn this. I could publish the Malacandrian grammar, right? I wouldn't be thinking about that. I would, I don't know, I'd probably run, I guess.
I would be screaming, yes.
Yeah, that's right. I would be running. But with a curiosity too, right? Because, yeah. But Ransom was kind of tired at that point. He was exhausted and hungry and scared, and so curiosity was the thing that knocked him over into connection. So yeah, so we have this language, Old Solar, and we have now an expert on Earth of this language, Old Solar. And what this little kind of preface does in this kind of nerdy sci-fi way is suggest that it's not so much in the original one. I have no intention of telling how the correspondence fell into my hands, right? Now it's nothing will induce me to reveal how Ransom got hold of the script. So at some part of this interplanetary battle, he intercepts these series of demonic letters, which are written primarily in Old Solar, but with some English words, and then he translates them. And so then Lewis is the editor and publisher rather than the translator. Mm-hmm. And that kind of makes sense. That's what he does in Out of the Silent Planet. It's Ransom's story, and Lewis writes it up and then publishes it for the world as fiction to get it out in the world. And so it's kind of a neat connection between them. Yeah. So
when I first heard about this, that there was a preface where Lewis connected two of his works, I immediately started thinking about, were there other connections among his other works?
Sure.
Maybe it's because I'm the product of the Marvel Cinematic Universe.
Right, of course. Yeah.
Could there be other connections? And one that I think is worth considering is, could some of the people that we meet in The Great Divorce be people that we've met in his other books?
Yeah, it's such a cool question. I am writing a book on the Ransom cycle. And so and basically what I'm doing, David and listeners, is like pulling together all the World War II materials as a whole. So, for example, like how does Mere Christianity, which is mostly written then, how does that fit in? And so the question I have is the Great Divorce. That's kind of one of the ones that's right there. It's written just after the third Ransom cycle. And I think it actually, it comes out actually some work that a fellow named Dr. Charlie Starr and I worked on over the last couple of years. We actually found what we think is the Archangel manuscript, which is the beginning of the response that Lewis wrote. He in the later preface, about 20 years after Screwtape, Lewis wrote another preface for a new edition, suggesting there should be an answer. There should be an Archangel answer to that. And we think that we found him playing with that. And so it very much feels like the Great Divorce universe in that kind of space, expansive and beautiful. But my argument is more like, and I have to, I want you still all to buy the book when this comes out in 100 years. But like my argument would basically be like, you can't answer in the same kind. Like the diction, the language would just be too high, and they can't make mistakes in the same way, and you can't laugh at them, right? So it doesn't work. But the Great Divorce is kind of the answer to Screwtape in the way that I imagine it. Now, characters, I don't know. I think that's for people to play with and see if they can make that connection, Certainly Lewis himself, like that's the thing that connects it, right? Lewis is the editor and writer of Out of Sight on Planet. He's now the editor and publisher of the Screwtape Letters. Same thing with Perelandra. Probably the same with that Hideous Strength. He just appears for like one mini chapter, and then he's gone. And he seems to be telling the story. And he's the protagonist of The Great Divorce. And so each of those books has him as the first person narrator right in the midst of the story. In The Great Divorce, it's about him, more personally, but it kind of still fits that. So not cinematic universe. What do we call it? Literary universe.
Literary universe.
Yeah,
well, as an aside, I've always wanted them to do a cinematic universe for the Inklings.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, well, that's what's the crazy stories, the Notion Club papers, right? That Tolkien wrote is it The Fall of Sauron? I think is part of the Middle Earth series. There's something
I'm not familiar with this.
Oh, it's awesome. Well, I mean, it's interesting and kind of terrible and super beautiful at points, but it's a rough copy of something called the Notion Club papers that Tolkien wrote, which was like a fictional description of an Inklings event, right? Yeah, I think you may have mentioned it a couple of years ago, and it's and so it's kind of interesting, and it brings, but something supernatural happens to them, right? And so something fantastic happens to all of them that's connected to like, Atlantis, and like anyway, it kind of drifts through history, and so it's connected back to Middle Earth, and so it's kind of so there are ways of making kind of the Inklings work. I think the hard one is Charles Williams. I'm not sure that anybody kind of wants his worlds to connect, except through Arthur, I guess, right?
Naturally.
Yeah.
So here's my question: If this Ransom stuff was in the handwritten preface, why did that not make it to print? Why aren't we reading that?
Yeah, and we have no idea. And like, I mean, I'll give a thought, but we don't really know. Like, we don't have any correspondence. The publishers were terrible at keeping records, and I find this with all the people that I'm studying. It's really hard to get records. We don't even know sales records in most cases from before World War I. So we don't have any record. We just happen to have this accidentally because Lewis was too lazy to rewrite everything. And so, God bless him. That's why we have this. And because it was the war, like normally he kept his manuscripts, and you got to kind of think of, like, manuscripts are good for Lewis. In Lewis's mind, they're good for two things. One is lighting his pipe. You cut it up into little pieces of paper and then use the pieces of paper to light the pipe, because paper is precious. And two, lighting the fire. So manuscripts are good for two reasons. And you can imagine, we don't have evidence of this, is my imagination, besides Lewis's desk, because he finishes manuscripts, he sets them on this pile of papers that then, like, as the winter goes on, the papers kind of go down, and then as the summer goes up, the papers go back up. And so you can see there's a kind of, like, where did Narnia go? it probably went, to start the coal fire or to light his pipe. Maybe for cat litter. There are all kinds of uses for paper for Lewis. I know. What do we have? Like one or two pages of Narnia manuscripts.
Yeah,
a
a little bit of the Silver Chair, from what I recall.
That's right. Yeah. And so it's not much. And so what I think just simply happened was, like, the publisher is like, well, this is cute, but we didn't publish the other book. Do you have the next book ready? Well, I've got Ransom to, I've got him to Perelandra, and he's met the lady. And they're like, yeah, I think, can you just make this work for the Screwtape Letters? Mm-hmm. And you can just see that being a publisher thing. Lewis is, just so everybody's clear, Lewis is not famous at this point. He's just getting ready for the BBC, so he's not, or has had his first series. He's not super famous. He's not anything other than an Oxford Don who does some interesting things. And it's Screwtape itself that makes him the international character. So it's probably hard for us, he sold, 150 million books. It's hard for us to kind of think of him as that, but he's just an interesting prof.
Yeah.
That's it.
Quirky.
Yeah.
He also writes science fiction.
Yeah, wrote science fiction, wrote some poems, he's playing with apologetics, like each book, if you look at his like literary output up to Narnia, each book is a completely different kind of book from the previous book. And so you have like 20 books up to 1950, and they're all different genres. Each one's a different genre. So that's pretty hard to kind of pin down, right? Mm-hmm. So a publisher's like, I'm taking a risk here. Let's give this a try. We already know that thousands of readers have read this. We don't know if they'll buy it in book form. Let's make this tight. And so what happens is Lewis then writes this basically tight script, which is, so here's some issues you have when reading demonic letters, as if we do this every day. And so here's some advice on it. But what's kind of interesting is that, Lewis at one point says that, the sort of, so in the published preface that you're reading, says the sort of script which is used in this book can very easily be obtained by anyone who has at once learned the knack. Okay? But disposed and, excitable people aren't going to learn it from me. Right? Mm-hmm. Now, of course, we're all reading that as like the sort of script is in like the demonic language or something, right? And I think that works. But when you have the new ones, the next paragraph in the handwritten preface is he goes into what the script is. The script is old solar language, and Ransom learned it on Malacandra, Mars. And here are some things you need to know about what that language means. And one of the kind of the most beautiful parts of that is that in Screwtape Letters you can see God is called the enemy with a capital E, right? Everything's upside down. Well, the capital E is sort of like a verbal tick for demons. They can't help but say something honorific with God. So it's kind of like, like in the old the 1001 Arabian Nights or something, where it's like, Al Grand Vizier, peace be upon him, right? Where that's the name is a whole title. Every time demons reference God, even just by pronoun, there's something in the way that Old Solar is built that gives reverence to God.
Huh.
Yeah, I know. Isn't that kind of neat? It just, kind of gives me chills. Like, it just built right into the language is this essential reality. Like, and this is actually important for understanding Screwtape. There's not an equal battle between demons and God or something like that, right? There may be a battle between demons and angels, but demons are on the losing side, and God is just not on the same playing field. It's not that kind of universe. And so it's built into the very framework. So demons grudgingly have to reference respect to God every time they speak about God. It's kind of a neat factor, yeah. Of course, that's all hidden to us in the preface we've got.
That idea reminds me of the first time I saw the Screwtape Letters performed on the stage. And this was at least 20 years ago, I don't think it was Max McLean's group, but whoever was putting it on, whenever he had to say the word Christian, he would always have to put in all of this effort to get the words out.
Yeah, like it's like a, like what is that when you want to throw up? Kind of that thing in the back of the throat, kind of, or the bile coming up, the heat coming out of the mouth. Yeah, there's something, but there's something physiological about language. There's, it's not, in Lewis's world, the universe is created by voice, by song, by speaking, by calling, right? And so the language is not accidental. It's, Lewis is, willing to kind of accept whatever evolutionary or scientific plan exists in the world. He doesn't want to really challenge that, but he wants to say that language itself has this kind of something to it, that literature, poetry, these things, move and shape themselves in different ways. And he was a pretty popular writer in a way that 2 centuries earlier nobody would have looked at, right? But there's still something essential. And I think this is I think Tolkien goes even further at saying there's something kind of like a mythic language that exists behind all languages, right? So, yeah, it's kind of and Owen Barfield, if you want to bring up the Inklings, right?
I do have a deep suspicion that idea of an old solar, even though Tolkien was generally not a fan of most of the stuff that Lewis did, I still get the impression that was still a conversation that happened at the Eagle and Child about what would this original language have been like.
Well, there's a funny letter. Do you know the letter that Tolkien wrote to the publisher to get Out of the Silent Planet published?
No.
So it was originally rejected, and Tolkien kind of interposed himself and said, "Look, I think you should consider it." And he goes through and says, "Yeah, there are some issues with the book, and I'm a little suspicious of the character that he drew, which kind of looks Tolkien-like." But, the philology is pretty good. We've worked it out, right? And so he likes the references. So it's actually a very positive letter. And so it got written because of that intervention. It's probably published because the publisher says, it doesn't work for our press, but I'm on the board of another press. Let's get it over there, and let's get it out. See if that editorial team will take it. And so, yeah, you're right. Tolkien doesn't love Lewis's work in general. Certainly did not like the Screwtape Letters, which are actually dedicated
to him.
Awesome. But in the end does promote certainly the Out of the Silent Planet, which came out of that kind of personal connection they had.
I can't help but wonder if the original preface had remained, if that would have sweetened the deal for Tolkien a little bit. It's like now when you're reading it, don't think about angels and demons and stuff. Just think language.
Yeah,
Old Solar.
That's right. Yeah, well, maybe that's it. And the philological arm. I think that Tolkien, if he could get over his anxiety about Lewis doing theology and overstepping his bounds, I think that's kind of a clever thing that Tolkien would have liked. This idea that there are verbicidal demons out there trying to kill words and then to resurrect them into kind of, zombie words that then, suck the brains out of culture. Well, that's actually a pretty good image, isn't it? Anyway, I think Tolkien would like that idea. But, it's, everybody had their weaknesses. Lewis's weakness in that group was certainly that he could be kind of gruff and move quickly over things and then just kind of skate over issues and just not worry about them. Tolkien's was not that issue. He was like, if he caught on to something, he held on to that and nursed it for a while. So, yeah. Yeah. Anyway, yeah, no, you're right. It's. I think he would have liked that aspect of it. So, I don't know. We'll see. Yeah.
Maybe they could have, written a sequel specifically focusing on the linguistic demons. I think he could have brought Tolkien on board with a little bit more careful handling.
Well, what was it? They were working on a book in the late 40s together. I don't remember what it was, but
it was about language. It was what Dr. Stephen Beebe found and uses as basis of the craft of communication.
Yeah, and so I think if they had done that, which of course they're oil and water when it comes to working together, right? Lewis would be like, okay, I'll write my chapter tonight, my pajamas, and Tolkien would be like, well, I'm working on the 14th draft. And it's just a footnote, but it's an important footnote. And so I think I would have been surprised if they got a space and time nonfiction book out the way that they ended up writing space and time fiction. But certainly that would have, I think, shown us the things that we don't know that happened in the Inklings events and in their conversations, which are like how they connect to one another on the ideas of myth, the great stories at the center of things, all that kind of the links that we can see and we can put together when we read their work. Mm-hmm. I think that would have come out in that particular book if they had gotten far enough to get a draft, right? Or more than a page or two, so a few pages. So, yeah. But thanks to Dr. Beebe for finding and publishing that material. I think that was like 8 years ago now, so I should probably know it better. Yeah.
I'm actually still working through his book at the moment. It's really good, but
good.
It's not
is in the craft book? Is it in the? Is it he actually reproduces it in that book, or
at least not in the parts that I've read? But it was the essence of what was in that fragment was what drove that book. The idea of Lewis being that master communicator.
Yeah, well, that tells you he found that in 2011, 2012, and the book just came out a year or two ago. You can understand why my book is also, several years behind. So, but when it comes out, I look forward to people then doing what we're doing with his work. So, yeah.
Okay, by season 6 of Pints with Jack, I expect it done.
Oh goodness, I don't know. It's to find this is the thing. Lewis was great because he wrote these short, tight projects that depended on him alone. And when it didn't depend on him alone, then things got really hung up. So it took a while to get his editorial work of Charles Williams done, because there were other people and Charles Williams' widow and things like that. But when his own work, he just did the work. And he liked the deadline, he was, he didn't send in the Screwtape Letters one at a time. He waited till he had critical mass, made the contacts, and submitted them all as a group because he knew he may not get it done right during turn time. He didn't write a lot during the sort of 8-9 weeks of the major 3 terms in Oxford. He didn't do a lot of writing in those times, and so he did this burst of writing. That works, but with scholarship today, it's just so weighty, and you just have to do all this reading. There are literally 200 articles written about the Screwtape Letters, so.
All I'm hearing is excuses.
Yes, excuses. I know.
I'm
Anyway,
holding you to this.
but I do have I am trying to get my thesis into a book, which is on Lewis's the way he understands visually spirituality, spiritual life, and the way he invites us into that. So that's what that book will be out next year or the year after. So, yeah. Okay.
Well, I look forward to interviewing you about that. And
we'll see. That's going to be one of those.
It's going to happen.
Yeah.
It's going to happen. We should still be in this season.
Well, the book's written. It's not that, but even publication takes a year or two, whereas Lewis could get it out in just a few days. I will note that when I originally published, I got to be the one that published the handwritten manuscript, and it turns out others had seen it. They just didn't kind of click into what it was, and it was Notes and Queries, an Oxford journal, that published it, and they got it done in 6 weeks from submission to print, which is, I think, a record in the world right today. So anyway, so kudos to them. So, yeah.
Well, speaking of things happening quickly, very soon you'll be back on this show, but on a main episode, when I think you're going to be co-hosting with Matt, and you're going to be talking about one of the Screwtape Letters.
Oh, excellent. Yeah, it's great to read these. I read them every year, and read them in different forms each year. So last time I read them out loud to my son. So it was kind of a nice way to read. So
wonderful stuff. Well, thank you very much for coming on the Skype session and talking us through the prefaces and the links to Perelandra.
Beautiful. I look forward to talking to you again.
And listeners, check back in next week when we'll have another Skype session. Cheers.